Hi, we are Alan and Julie Guthrie. We are here to read your Advent story for December 13th. Today's story is called The Warrior Leader. This story is about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho. If you are following along in your Jesus Story Bible, we are on page 108.
The Warrior Leader. Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, from Joshua 3 and 6. After Moses died, God gave his people a new leader. His name was Joshua, which means the Lord saves. Joshua was going to lead God's people into the special land that God had promised to give them. By this time, God's people had been wandering around in the baking desert for 40 years. So you can imagine how sick they were of sand and anything yellow and tense and walking and being hot. And how happy they were to reach the edge of the desert and to see their beautiful new home right there in front of them, all cool and green and lovely. There was only one problem: Jericho. Jericho was a city, but it wasn't just any old city. It was a fortress, and it stopped anyone from getting into the land. The people looked at Jericho, at the big, giant, scary walls all around it, at the tall, towering ramparts, at the heavy iron gates bolted shut, and at each other. It was a really big city. What would they do? No one knew, but God knew. And God told Joshua what to do. But Joshua must have looked surprised, because it was a very odd battle plan indeed, as we'll soon find out. Then God made his people a promise. I will always be with you, and I will never ever leave you. If you do what I say, your lives in the new land will be happy and everything will go well. So Joshua gathered his army together. They had their swords and their spears and shields. They were ready to fight. But the plan wasn't about fighting. It was about trusting and doing what God said. Joshua's army went marching around the city, day after day after day. They're too scared to fight, the people in Jericho said. There they go, marching all around the city. But they were wrong. God's people weren't scared. They were waiting for God to tell them what to do next. On the seventh day, God told his people to march around the city, not once, but 7 times. Then God told everyone to make as much noise as they could. Has anyone ever told you to make as much noise as you possibly can? Probably not your parents. Well, imagine that noise. Add 39,999 other people making that noise too. And you get the idea, ear splitting. And as it turns out, stone splitting too, because the huge, strong walls of Jericho just crumbled to the ground. As if they were made of sand, Jericho vanished in a great cloud of dust. So it was that God's people entered their new home, and they didn't have to fight to get in. They only had to walk. Joshua said, God has brought you safely here. Now will you do what he says? Everyone said, we promise. Only God can make your heart happy. Joshua said, so don't pray to pretend gods. No, they said, never. I'm afraid they didn't keep their promise. They didn't do what God said, and many years later, just as God warned them, things would go badly for God's people. They would lose their home. Enemies would capture them and take them off as slaves, and God's people would scatter into many different lands. But God's plan was still working. One day, he would give his people another leader and another home. But this home, no one could ever take from them.
Our story today comes from Joshua 3 and 6. Let's read Joshua 6, 2 through 5. The Lord said to Joshua, "Look, I have handed Jericho, its kings, and its fighting men over to you. March around the city with all the men of this war, circling the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times while the priests blow the trumpets. When there is a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear its sound, you have all the people give a mighty shout. Then the city wall will collapse and the people will advance, each man straight ahead." So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant and have 7 priests carry 7 trumpets in front of the ark of the Lord." He said to the people, "Move forward, march around the city, and have the armed troops go ahead of the ark of the Lord." In the Hebrew, the name Joshua is the same name as Jesus. It means you need God to rescue you, which is why God sent Jesus to rescue you. Joshua and God's people obeyed God. Joshua and the people did not have to follow battle plans. They just had to do what God said. Only God can make the walls of Jericho fall down by having people shout and blow trumpets. And he did. So the people entered their new home, but remember the end of the story. The people soon stopped obeying God. They did not do what God said, and many years later they would lose their home. But God promised he would always be with them. So one day he would give them another leader and another home. That leader is Jesus.